Compared to the giddy heights of Vanbrugh's later achievements, the fragmented story of his youth is often overlooked. But today, the importance of early experience on character development is well understood. Vanbrugh did not just have any experience. He was an active player in England's arguably greatest revolution. But the key question and scope of this paper is, why was he involved and how did it affect him? To answer this, we have to understand his childhood. Vanbrugh's grandfather, Gillis van Brugg, was a Dutch Calvinist refugee and socially aspirational city merchant, two traditionally marginalised constituencies that were later championed by the Whigs. Although Gillis arrived at the turn of the century, and so this identity may appear far removed by the time of Vanbrugh's birth in 1664, it formed the backdrop to his upbringing. Gillis married the daughter of a Flemish merchant, and so their son Giles, Vanbrugh's father, was still fully Dutch. In 1641, he was described as an alien. Although Giles, as an older son, was baptised Anglican, his sisters were baptised into the Dutch church, married Anglo-Dutch merchants, and baptised their children, Vanbrugh's first cousins, Dutch. By contrast, Giles married into the well-connected English family, the Carletons. He was a warden of the Anglican St. Stephen's Walbrook, and he transitioned from being a merchant to a gentleman who socialised with the local gentry in Chester. But this did not stop him from also being a deacon in the Dutch Church of London, a very intimate acquaintance with the dissenting minister Matthew Henry, whose lectures he regularly attended, and maintaining enough links with the city to gain Vanbrugh a prestigious last-minute place in the East India Company in 1682. Thus, despite the glossy Carlton veneer, Vanbrugh's childhood was heavily coloured by aspirational mercantile and nonconformist life. This made him inherently predisposed to support the Whigs. Background aside, Giles was also political. The crisis of whether to exclude the Catholic James II from the succession, the issue around which the Whig faction coalesced, was fed by paranoia of the supposed popish plot. Giles was heavily preoccupied by these Jesuitical Romanists. In 1678, he developed a singular, if somewhat eccentric, foreign policy suggestion: a Black Ops-style raid to steal the Vatican Library. He signed off the letter by writing that he was a true Protestant and zealous prosecutor of what may conduce to the good of church and state, and upon His Majesty's command I would venture my life and fortune. Conspicuously, Giles chose to entrust this to the famously liberal Bishop of London, Henry Compton, a later signatory to William of Orange's invitation. Returning from India in 1685, Vanbrugh expressed the same patriotism by joining the army. The president of the English factory in Surat wrote, somewhat unkindly, that Vanbrugh was in big expectation of much sooner raising his fortunes in England, depending on his good friends to put him into places of great profit, credit, and ease. This suggests a government sinecure. As the oldest and first fully English son in his family, Vanbrugh wished to continue the family trajectory through a job in public life. The same was true of his younger brothers, who later joined the church and navy, and his first cousins from his father's brother William, who joined the army and law. At first, Vanbrugh attempted to get a job with the Earl of Clarendon as he passed through Chester en route to becoming the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. This was via his kinsman, the Earl of Huntingdon, who instead offered Vanbrugh a junior commission. Given the expectation on Vanbrugh and the fact that this was his third career, his sudden resignation from the army is bizarre. Here, the context is key. Shortly before Vanbrugh enlisted in January 1686, King James shocked Parliament by pressuring them to allow the many Catholics that had been temporarily drafted into the army in the wake of the Monmouth Rebellion to remain. This was antagonised by Louis XIV's revocation of the Edict of Nantes, causing Huguenot refugees to surge across the Channel in much the same way as the Van Brugg family. In June 1686, the issue came to a head in the trial of Sir Edward Hales, a prominent Catholic officer. Vanbrugh was aware of this as his own senior officer, Captain Owen McCarty, had been dispensed in the same batch of officers by James. Finally, in July, James attempted to dismiss Compton, the bishop to whom Giles had written. But what was it that Vanbrugh objected to? It would be easy to attribute it to a deeply held Protestantism, but that does not explain why he knowingly joined a semi-Catholic army for an openly Catholic king. Besides, Giles Vanbrugh's nonconformism famously mellowed into a nonconformist approach to religion generally by his son. Instead, it seems that Vanbrugh objected not so much to what James was imposing, but how he was imposing it. Increasingly, the army did not resemble a tool to suppress unlawful dissent against the crown, but rather a tool to suppress lawful dissent by the crown. Vanbrugh's resignation is our first clear indication of his politics. The crown was not above Parliament. Vanbrugh's next job was equally close to controversy. In July 1687, James dissolved Parliament in preparation for a purge of England's governing class. This reached a head at Magdalen College, Oxford, in September 1687, where he demanded the appointment of Anthony Farmer as president. The Fellows refused on account of the cleric having recently tried to French kiss a woman at the Lobster Tavern in Abingdon. 2 weeks later, the shaken city of Oxford appointed Vanbrugh's kinsman, the Earl of Abingdon, as its high steward. Like many Tories who had traditionally supported the crown, the Earl was disillusioned with the king. In this role, he appointed his like-minded and presentable young relation, Vanbrugh, to join his retinue. Abingdon was heavily political and fostered an atmosphere of dissent. His brother-in-law was the Earl of Danby, who would lead the Northern Rebellion against James and sign the impending invitation to William of Orange. The stadtholder had recently announced his opposition to Catholics holding office in England. Abingdon also appointed his nephew Robert Barty to join his retinue, who had been discharged from the army for similar reasons to Vanbrugh. Their grievances were enhanced when, in January 1688, the seemingly infertile queen became pregnant, risking a new Catholic dynasty. By the time that James dismissed Abingdon from his position in February, it seems that Vanbrugh had been transformed from a malcontent into a Williamite. At some point between February and the autumn, the 24-year-old Vanbrugh, Robert, and his brother Peregrine travelled to The Hague. It is possible that this was simply an awkwardly timed gap year. But given their conspicuous timing, journey to William's capital, that Peregrine was in touch with Danby, and that James's ambassador to France, Bevel Skelton, was aware of their journey, it seems that this was some kind of pro-revolutionary mission. Here, Vanbrugh was not simply a companion. Skelton reported that he led all the Barty family which way I would. When Vanbrugh was imprisoned in Calais in the autumn, he claimed that it was because he'd been accused of speaking something in the favour of the enterprise the King William was then upon the point of executing upon England. With Vanbrugh's politics established, we see him learning the art of politics to free himself from prison. As the situation deteriorated in England, France dispatched spies to gather intelligence. One of them asked for a high-profile Englishman to be arrested in case a prisoner swap became necessary. Vanbrugh soon deduced that this is what had happened to him. In 1691, his health began to deteriorate, and he was moved to the Château de Vincennes outside Paris by armed coach. He seized the opportunity of being closer to both the exiled Jacobite court at Saint-Germain and Versailles. Rightly assuming that the initial excuse for his arrest had been forgotten, he appealed to James's Secretary of State under the disguise of a Jacobite whose identity had been mistaken for a Williamite. Now his letters begin to mature. He began with a masterful combination of flattery and obfuscation. I am beholding to you for a favour in speaking to the king for me. My misfortune to be so little known to you, sir, makes the obligation much the greater, and I humbly thank you for it. You have heard, no doubt, my story from others, so I shall not trouble you with it myself. He then propagates the half-truth that although I have never been accused of anything against the king or the state of France, he was proposed for an exchange because they look on me as a partisan of the Prince of Orange. This was followed by the outright lie that if this occurred, he would be forced to throw myself at the Prince of Orange's feet for protection and take the oaths of allegiance to him. This, you may be sure, I have no mind to do, since I apply myself to you that I may avoid it. The letter was a gamble, but Vanbrugh correctly judged that in the opaque world of the Jacobite court, which was still in touch with many of the signatories to William's invitation, it was believable. Saint-Germain pressed Versailles for more information, which simply invented a new excuse, that Vanbrugh had been arrested for trying to leave France without a passport in a time of war. It dawned on Vanbrugh that a prisoner exchange had not taken place because he was not a state prisoner. This was a step closer to the truth. In the meantime, the spy for whom Vanbrugh had been taken hostage had been replaced by Martin de Forval, one of France's most senior operatives. De Forval had been arrested in England, but his identity remained hidden. To preserve this, Versailles now stopped Vanbrugh's letters. Realizing this, he used his still intact Jacobite disguise to smuggle another letter to his mother, who forwarded it to Whitehall. In the letter, Vanbrugh explained that he was being mistreated to increase pressure for a prisoner exchange with Forval. He had confronted Joseph d'Olivier about this, a broker in the exchange of prisoners, who riposted men don't always keep what they promise. Vanbrugh instructed his mother that if the government refused to release Forval, she was to expose the d'Oliviers. Back in France, Vanbrugh pressed the advantage, repeatedly writing to Louis XIV about the squalor of his conditions. Indeed, much of the French correspondence concerning Vanbrugh was signed SM or Sa Majesté. He was closer to the levers of power than one might think. In 1692, Vanbrugh was transferred to the Bastille. He had transformed himself into the prisoner of state for which he had initially been mistaken. He was now described as Monsieur de Vanbrugh, Anglais. Due to his leaked intelligence about d'Olivier, the English arrested Pierre d'Olivier and 16 French merchants on suspicion of espionage. With mounting pressure on both governments, the Jacobite Earl of Aylesbury suggested a new exchange, which was finally approved in November. During his time in prison, Vanbrugh experienced the abuse of power against which the Whigs were fighting. Not only did this reinforce his politics, it also taught him how to play the political game. He had learned how to befriend his enemies, coerce 3 governments into action, and transform his identity, all from a prison cell with only partial information. On Vanbrugh's return to England in 1693, now aged 28, he experienced a nation transformed according to Whig ideals. It had pivoted from being subject to an aspiring Catholic autocrat in the pocket of France to a pro-trade, pro-tolerance, semi-constitutional Dutchman at war with France. Vanbrugh's kinsman, Robert Barty, had granted him a sinecure in the Duchy of Lancaster during his absence, meaning that he now had the long-awaited government post. Despite this, having only just returned to safety and with no naval training, Vanbrugh volunteered to destroy the port of Brest in 1694. This was with the Marquis of Carmarthen, son of the Earl of Danby, now Duke of Leeds. Brest was the largest base for France's navy, which was attempting to blockade England's struggling economy, adding to William's unpopularity. Vanbrugh had supported the revolution, now was his chance to defend it. He was enormously brave and rewarded with a captaincy in the Marines. By examining how Vanbrugh became a revolutionary and the effect it had on him, I have tried to illustrate why Whiggery was an integral part of his identity and how he learnt to play politics. Not only does this help us to understand a pivotal moment in English history, it also helps us to understand Vanbrugh's later trajectory. For a largely irreligious man who led a famously varied life, his politics acted as a compass, underpinning the liberality behind his plays, his popularity with the Kit Kat Club, and his ultimate emergence as its primary artistic spokesman. This was in developing an architectural style which, as Matthew explored so eloquently before me, celebrated the post-revolutionary nation for which he had fought. Thank you.